Champ, the ranking member, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 712, the Sunshine for Regulatory Decrees and Settlements Act of 2015. Rather than bringing sunshine into the rulemaking process, it throws after-midnight shade on this process. In fact, the Sunshine for Regulatory Decrees and Settlements Act pulls the plug on regulations in place to protect the health, safety, and well-being of the people. This misnomer legislation should be renamed the Bedtime for Consent Decrees and Settlements Act. Another great name, the Leave Volkswagen Alone Act. Title I of H.R. 712 imposes numerous burdensome procedural requirements on agencies and courts that are designed to hamstring and ultimately prevent the use of consent decrees and settlements that ensure the enforcement of the law. Proponents of this provision argue that it's necessary because federal agencies collude with pro-regulatory plaintiffs to advance a mutually agreed-upon regulatory agenda through the use of consent decrees and settlement agreements. According to my Republican colleagues, this so-called sue and settle litigation specifically allows agencies to skirt the requirements of the Administrative Procedures Act to dictate the contents of an agency rulemaking or bind agency action. Sadly, however, the majority has not put forth a single dust particle of evidence, of credible evidence, to support this claim. To the contrary, consent orders and settlement agreements are important tools in ensuring the timely compliance with statutory deadlines put in place by Congress to protect the environment and the public's health and safety. In fact, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, reported in December 2014 that there is zero evidence indicating that agencies collude with public interest groups in reaching consent decrees, as the majority has often alleged. In its report, the GAO referred to these lawsuits as, quote, deadline suits because they simply compel agencies to take statutorily required actions within a designated time frame. The GAO also found little evidence that deadline suits determine the substantive outcome of agency action because agency officials stated that they would not and have not and would never agree to settlements in a deadline suit that finalize the substantive outcome of rulemaking or declare the substance of the final rule. Earlier this year, Amit Narang, a regulatory policy advocate for Public Citizen, also clarified during the legislative hearing on H.R. 712 that, quote, all of the settlements scrutinized by GAO pursuant to the EPA's rulemaking authority under the Clean Air Act went through the public notice and comment process, allowing all members of the public an opportunity to comment on the rule before it is finalized, end quote. This finding confirms that there is no credible supporting the proposition that federal agencies engage in backroom deals with pro-regulatory groups to circumvent the APA or substantively bind the agency in subsequent rulemaking. In the absence of actual evidence of collusion between federal agencies and plaintiffs, H.R. 712 addresses a non-existent problem through a series of requirements designed to undermine the law by preventing the enforcement of statutes passed by Congress to protect the public. Also to slow down agency action and bust the door wide open to almost anyone who wants to impede agency action by intervening in these actions. Now, is it working people? Is it small business owners? Is it retirees who are asking for this kind of relief from regulations that protect the health, safety, and well-being of them? No, it's not the people, it's the big corporations that want this legislation to pass. For example, H.R. 712 would allow for nearly any private party to intervene in a consent decree revealing the legislation's true purpose which is stacking the deck in industry's favor to avoid enforcement of the law. Mr. Speaker, the only reason for the unprecedented delay in agency rulemaking, the so-called diminishing transparency of the regulatory process, is that my Republican colleagues have argued that regulatory transparency.
Mr. Speaker, may I give the gentleman 1 additional minute?
The gentleman has 1 additional minute.
They've argued that regulatory transparency, and I thank the gentleman, is not important to public participation in the rulemaking process. Millions of Americans have, in a recent rulemaking process, millions of Americans have commented on a single proposed rulemaking representing the largest public response to any request for public comment in a federal rulemaking in history. And this extensive activity just last year alone hardly suggests an agency process shrouded in secrecy and in need of reform. So, with there being no evidence that consent decrees and settlements are collusion between federal agencies and pro-human interest groups, there simply is no need for this legislation. And with that, I would ask my colleagues to vote against this, to vote it down. And I'll yield back.